right, we are going to give just a minute or two to Professor Cavanaugh to respond, if he'd like to respond to any of the comments that Drs. Geertsema or Gerstein have given us. So, and then we will come to the audience.
Thanks. Just want to echo a few things that I heard. One of the things that Larry said led me to think it's quite right to say that we all have to take responsibility for violence in our society. The problem, in other words, is violence. It's not religious violence. People kill and die for all sorts of things, and we need to kind of level the playing field and work that out. And so I'm very happy at his final proposal that the Pope and the Dalai Lama and people of all sorts of different faiths preach nonviolence for the next 25 years. But that can't be confined to what we do on Sundays and churches and so on. That is a problem not just for so-called religions, but it's a problem for national leaders and so on. And until we take it seriously at that level, that killing for the nation is a serious problem and not just killing for God, that they're both serious problems, then we won't get anywhere. Let me echo too what Margaretha said about the myth of the clash of civilizations. That's exactly right, and I use the term Orientalism in this paper, and I think I forgot to actually say it, but I think that's exactly right. The way that the myth, I mean, what I'm trying to do in this book, I've written about nonviolence elsewhere, but what I'm trying to do in this book is clear some ground away from a particular set of blinders that we have that makes us ignore certain kinds of violence. And let me illustrate using this example that Margaretha raised, one way that it works, right? 1979, suddenly the streets of Tehran are filled with people chanting "Death to America." Why? Well, we like to tell ourselves it's because they've had some sort of crazy religious experience over there. And it's essentially a kind of clash of civilizations. They're just different. And what we do when we do that by saying, oh, it's religion, is we excuse ourselves from having to look at the actual history of Western dealings with Iran and the coup that happened in 1953, where the British and the US deposed a democratically elected government and installed the Shah, who tortured and killed tens of thousands of people over the next 26 years until the revolution in 1979 happened. So religion helps us then focus and say, aha, they're different, and we don't have to look at the history of the actual dealings. So it's a set of blinders that I'm really trying to kind of remove. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you. We have microphones roving around, and if you could raise your hands, I will help direct those microphones to you so that we get a kind of backlog built up. So Katie, and then Professor Valliere, and we have one here in the middle. Maybe you could.
Thank you very much for your comments this evening. They were very interesting. And you all have talked a lot about how religion is a myth in creating violence. And kind of my question is, then where do you go from here? How do you go about peacemaking and nonviolence and promoting those things outside of the realm and the myth of religion? I don't know if you all want to. I mean, Larry's suggestion at the end, I think, is an excellent suggestion that we could begin by Christians and Buddhists and Muslims kind of talking about nonviolence and preaching it and practicing it. For me, I mean, where the rubber hits the road, you know, in 2003, the Iraq War was coming, and it seemed like an inevitability. And most, I'll just talk from the Christian experience, most major Christian bodies in the United States raised serious questions through official channels about the justification for this war. The Vatican spoke out very forcefully in the months leading up to it, saying this does not meet the criteria of a just war. The war broke out, and Catholics went and fought it anyway, right?
And there are prominent Catholic commentators like Michael Novak and George Weigel arguing that the Pope's opinion is to be respected, but really it's the president who makes the call, and that Catholics should kind of follow the president's lead on this. Now, I think that is an example of where loyalty to the nation unjustifiably takes precedence over one's loyalty, in this case, to the gospel. And so what the subject of my book, there's no theology in this book, but people ask me, about theology, and I say the implicit theology in the book is that it's a critique of idolatry. And that's all through the book. I mean, the fact is that people treat all sorts of things as absolutes. And that's what the Bible calls idolatry. It's nothing new. It's an age-old sin. And so when people say, oh, his religion is money or his religion is the stock market, that's right. That's exactly right. And so what I'm trying to do is call attention to these kinds of functional idolatries. And if people actually took that seriously, one of the things they could do would be not to fight in unjust wars. That would be a good start. I mean, we can get to talking about nonviolence, but even if we took the just war theory seriously, it would have enormously radical consequences if suddenly great numbers of Christians just said, I'm sorry, this is not a just war, and we're going to sit this one out.
I think the function of focusing on religion here is the othering, right? To say, oh, they are so different from us, almost as if they are not human. It could justify a war. I think the problem is foreign policy, not necessarily religion. I think when we make the connection between religion and violence, it is perhaps mostly because of terrorism, right? And what we see, what happens in terrorist attacks. And I think for those of us who work in the news media, this is really something that we very carefully have to look at. There's this symbiotic relationship between the media and terrorists, right? Because the terrorists need the media coverage, and the media have to inform people of what's going on. But there is a whole new development, well, not new, but it's peace journalism. It is where you ask the questions, of, by publicizing this terrorism, are we more focusing on kind of fueling the fires of hatred than perhaps looking for solutions? So that's one thing that I would recommend.
I think a couple of things. One is your perspective and your attitude. What do you believe is possible? So if you're faced with conflict, if you understand that you have a myriad of choices in how you respond to the conflict, that'll help you to bring a peaceful solution. And I think the way you develop that is by both reading and going to places where you can learn the skills to develop conflict resolution. Now, in terms of religion itself, in Indianapolis, we're really, really fortunate. There are a number of organizations in Indianapolis that work across faith and bring people together so that they have a richer understanding of the similarities and differences and have collaborative projects where they accomplish things. So one of them is the Interfaith Hunger Initiative that's doing remarkable work. Another one is the International Interfaith Initiative. And there are other ones in Indianapolis that if you Google, you'll find. And I think they set the example of how what we would think would be adversaries have actually become allies.
Right, Professor Valliere has a comment, and then when he's done, we're going to have a free microphone. So raise your hand. Okay, we've already got a claimant over here. So
this is for Professor Cavanaugh in the first instance. I'm very impressed by the way you take the distinction unpack the distinction between the religious and the secular, to expose a myth of religious violence, to critique all sorts of nationalistic and chauvinistic and frankly fanatical expressions that don't recognize themselves as violence. It's wonderful. But the presentation left me wondering whether the distinction between the religious and the secular has any meaning at all, or whether it is something to be scrapped. I guess I'm asking you to comment on that. I see what you're doing by saying it's a contingent distinction, it's a historical distinction, it's not absolute. I agree with all of that. Is it a useless distinction, and should we scrap it?
Yeah, I wish it were useless. Unfortunately, it's very useful. But there are benign uses too.
I guess that's what I want to hear.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a good point. Yeah, and I've been pressed on this before. I talk about it a little bit more in the book at a little bit more length. I mean, there's a famous study by James Luba in 1912 which offers more than 50 different definitions of religion, and some people have concluded that there's no way to define religion. And Jonathan Z. Smith says, no, you can define religion 50 different ways. And that's I think, the lesson here. So I fall into the camp which is constructivist, meaning that these terms, they get used in different ways at different times. And I'm pointing specifically here to one of the malignant uses. But there are perfectly legitimate, ordinary, everyday uses that are benign. And one of them is the fact that there's a Department of Religion at Butler University, for example, right? I think it's a good thing that there are religious studies departments and departments of religion at colleges in the United States. And the reason I think that's a good thing is because theology then gets done on the sly. And I think that's a good thing. At supposedly secular universities, theology sneaks in the back door. And so that's a kind of strategic reason for not simply dropping the term religion. There are some that want to drop it altogether. Timothy Fitzgerald is a religious studies scholar who has written a lot on this and kind of woke up one day and realized there's nothing called religion, and he wants to disband religious studies departments and scatter them into other departments, the anthropology department and the sociology department and so on. I don't think that that's necessary, and I think that the conclusion should not be, the proper conclusion is not that there's no such thing as religion. The proper conclusion is there is such a thing as religion, but it's as a constructed category that has various different uses. And so, on a colloquial basis, I try to avoid the term just because I've become allergic to it. But on a colloquial level, sometimes you can use the term to distinguish what you do in church from what you do in your garden. And I wouldn't want to absolutize that distinction, but sometimes in a rough and ready way, it's useful. So I'm not one of those that wants to abolish it entirely, but I do think that we need to be very aware of what we're doing when we use these terms.
All right, we had a comment here in the middle, and that microphone needs to make its way over there to Mr. Bronski. And we'll have a free one after this comment too, so get your hand up if you'd like it.
I was at a panel on New Year's Eve and at the School of Metaphysics, and we read the Universal Peace Covenant, and we talked about, one of the presenters talked about just war, and there was another presenter that talked about Zen Buddhism, and it just ties into what we've been talking about tonight, and I just wanted to let people know that I'm a part of studying nonviolence through the work of Marshall Rosenberg's book on nonviolent communication, and the Center for Nonviolence is doing that kind of studying nonviolence that you mentioned, and what you also mentioned about the churches working together. We've also got the Church Federation just around the corner here from the Butler campus. Just what I wanted to know, since I'm working, I've been doing a lot of peace work, groundwork through the U.S. Indiana campaign for the U.S. Department of Peace, but that legislation has lost momentum, and I wondered if there's any way that you could inform maybe it's not legislating it, but if we did have a Department of Peace, would there be a way of coming together with all of the research that you've already been doing? What do you think about that? And also just like having departments of peace in universities, such as the one that I went to. We had a major for peace and global studies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I mean, the problem, of course, is that if you have a Department of Peace, you still have a Department of War, right, which is now called the Department of Defense. The Department of War has a budget which is in excess of $600 billion annually, and I doubt the Department of Peace would be funded to such a generous extent. The Department of Defense, I mean, America spends more on its military than all the other nations of the world combined. And so that's that's really it's easy to get the churches and the synagogues and the mosques and the other places of worship talking about peace. The real trick is getting the nation as a whole to get people to stop kind of separating what they do in their faith life from what they support on a kind of national level, and that's the real trick. So I think it's a good idea to have a Department of Peace, but we should recognize that the reason that we can't is that it's in fundamental conflict with another very large department who's in charge of making war, and that's something that we need to have very serious discussions about and considerations about. I mean, part of the problem is we just don't even think. I mean, we don't think of our violence as violence. There's I did a paper recently called "When is Violence Not Violence?" and I quote from a State Department official who gave a talk over in Qatar to this a kind of national gathering of American policy experts with Muslim leaders, and it happens annually. But he talks about how it was a talk that he gave while the insurgency in Iraq after the invasion was very strong, and he says that we're not going to sit back and allow these people who try to enforce their will by using violence to gain the upper hand in Iraq. And I found this account in a journalist, an Egyptian journalist, who wrote, "Did the United States not use weapons when they invaded Iraq?" I mean, we don't even think of what we do as violence, and I think that's part of the issue.
I just want to make a quick comment. Going back to the Department of War, the Pentagon with a huge budget, I want to get back to the idea of private violence in contrast to the public violence of war that we're talking about. For many women around the world and also here, there is a daily war that's going on, violence against women, right? Private violence that can be emotional, financial, it can be physical. Yet when we talk about this violence, it seems to, kind of be pushed to the side because it's private, right? It's not like real violence like in the war. I mean, I would like to see a Department of Peace, interpersonal peace, of course global, but also in our interpersonal relationships, especially when we look at gender relationships.
Yeah, I think I come down on this a little bit differently in that I'm more optimistic about the long run. I think in the short term, I think Dr. Cavanaugh is right that the power of the gun is more powerful than peace. But in the long run, I think the species has an inherent desire to get along and to live peacefully on the planet. And so whatever we can do to plant the seed and develop the idea in the project ultimately will prove to be successful. So, you know, on one level we can talk about the mundane reality that we all experience in the room right now. But on another level, if we devote more of our energy, even if it's not money, into developing and promoting and demonstrating the concept of nonviolence, it spirals into the evolution of our species. So I'm more optimistic.
All right, we have a comment here, and then that microphone needs to go back to the woman in salmon, and then we have another comment up here.
This comment and questions for Dr. Cavanaugh. I also think it's really noble, your work's really noble in the sense that I am a person who hates when we justify violence for any reason, let alone religion, when I guess I'm a religious person, so that really grinds my gears. So I really appreciate your work. And I have some thoughts that I hope will be able to form into a question. But
so do we. So do we.
So I guess this is a kind of a question in light of the postmodern era that we live in that, and especially in America, we talk about a personal relationship with God, or a very individualistic experience in religion. And there's probably a lot of people in this room, or a lot of people in America in this day and age that would say that my individual relationship with the divine or with anything that is sacred in my particular religion is very different than the guy who cracks open the beer on a Monday night. That there's something fundamentally different about that than my individualistic experience. The sacredness, the divinity. There's these religious words that we would characterize to describe that. And so I guess my question is, what about that? And I mean, it's a reality of religion, and defining religion. And is it just another one of the 50, or is there something unique about that we can study as scholars, or is it just unstudyable because it's too personal or something like that? Yeah.
Let me see if I've got the question right. So,
like I said, it was going to be hard to form, but
so I mean, is the question that you're pressing might be something like this? I mean, is there really no difference between watching Monday Night Football and praying to Jesus?
Yeah.
I mean, is that what the question is?
Yeah, I think so. But also that. I mean, I think that you would say that there's no individual religious experience. We can't have that in a vacuum, right? But a lot of people would think otherwise in our postmodern Western world, where we have a personal relationship with God. And how does that fall into the categories of defining religion?
Yeah, let me try this as an answer, and you tell me if I'm getting at what you're getting at. You know, I mean, some people say, well, look, you know, sure, football fanaticism, you know, nationalism, money, all those kind of things. Those are not, you know, I mean, you can call that religion, but that's just a metaphor, right? The flag, nobody really thinks that the flag is a god, or that Peyton Manning is a god, and, you know, this kind of stuff, right?
Now you're on dangerous ground.
Those were moans of discontent, actually, just to be clear.
Can I change Peyton Manning for Jay Cutler? There you
go. That's also dangerous, I think.
You know, those are just metaphors, right? That people really, you know, but the question, of course, that you're raising is that it can't just be based on kind of interior criteria. The question is, what do you actually do with your body, right? What difference does it make to your actual practices in the material world? If you claim to believe in the God of Jesus Christ, but you don't get off the couch on Sunday morning, and you spend Monday through Friday in obsessive pursuit of profit in the stock market, then functionally your God is not the God of Jesus Christ. It's mammon, right? And so all of these questions need to be answered in a sense by what people do with their bodies and not just what they claim verbally. And so this kind of individualized experience is itself a kind of effect of a larger way that we discipline our bodies. I mean, the individualization of religion is an effect of the growth of capitalism and market economies and market states over the last 400 years or so, and it needs to be recognized as such. Does that get at what your question was? Okay.
All right, we had a comment up front here, and then we'll come back to the one.
Yes, I want to begin by agreeing with your assessment that it's relatively useless to distinguish between the secular and the religious when trying to explain the origins of violence. I agree with you because I basically believe the origins of violence are fundamentally preconscious and wrapped up with the very basic mechanisms by which life comes into existence and goes out of existence. But I'm also very grateful that you recognize there are some benign uses of that distinction between that which is religious and that which is secular. And the reason I say that is because I want to ask you this question. I'm familiar with an author by the name of V.S. Naipaul, who long before 9/11 anticipated the potential conflict between more radical segments of the Muslim community and the Western world. And in that essay, he pretty much defines secular as that which has to do with rationality, discourse, compromise, a definition of politics, by the way, that would have been quite compatible with Aristotle's own definition, where he equated man, the rational animal, with man, the political animal. And V.S. Naipaul's hope was that people would temper their religious enthusiasms and absolute commitments by a commitment to use rationality within the realm of politics, within the realm of resolving international disputes, as an alternative to trying to resolve all these disputes based on religious considerations. So my question to you is it not only the case that this is there are benign uses of that distinction, but is it possible that that might be a very important distinction in trying to reduce violence in the political process and work toward a more nonviolent political process?
Thanks. That's an excellent question. Insofar as rationality is equated with secularism and not with something called religion, then I don't think it's a benign distinction. There are different kinds of rationality. You know, Alistair McIntyre's book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? There's a lot of different kinds of rationality, and to say that there's only one kind and essentially to equate it with Western-style secularism, I think is a dangerous sort of move. There's a wonderful book by Roxanne Euban. It's Princeton University Press. I can't remember the year. It's called Enemy in the Mirror, and she examines different kinds of rationality in the Muslim world, and some of which are quite radical, but she tries to understand them on her own terms. But the point of the title of the book, The Enemy in the Mirror, is that she thinks that we oftentimes kind of project our own sort of irrationalities onto an enemy and create these kind of dichotomous categories of rationality versus irrationality as a way of kind of taking what's irrational in our own sort of systems and pushing it off onto others. And it's a wonderful book if you get a chance at it. But the general point that I'd want to make is I'd want to be very careful about not equating rationality with Western style secularism, and I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but maybe what I hear you saying is a kind of general admonition to tolerance and rationality, however that's defined, letting that flourish as a way of creating spaces where we can talk to one another. And if that's the case, then I would certainly endorse that. Oftentimes what I find is that the religious-secular distinction doesn't help in doing that. I mean, oftentimes what you find are a real kind of dichotomous approach to Muslim societies, for example, where you either have, the choices are presented as either theocracy or secularism. And I just don't think that those two extremes exhaust the possibilities of kinds of social orders where you could have cooperation between mosque and state in ways that seem foreign to the United States, but that work there and can produce spaces of tolerance and rationality. And so the myth of religious violence helps to kind of push people into that dichotomy, and I think it's unhelpful. One of the things that John Esposito points out about Islam is that the very act of calling Islam a religion automatically marks it as an abnormal religion because it doesn't separate religion from politics in the way that our definition of religion does. And so he tries to avoid, he's one of the preeminent scholars of Islam in the West, and he tries to avoid talking about Islam as a religion precisely because religion is this kind of Western term that automatically then distorts the lens through which we view Islam. And so, for those reasons, I still want to resist this kind of religious-secular dichotomy as often being unhelpful, while I want to embrace the kind of comments you made about dialogue, tolerance, rationality.
All right, we had two comments in the back, and you've got a microphone, right? Yeah, okay, and there's somebody right behind you. Let's have those comments together, and then we're going to have time at least for this one more question up here after there's a response, but let's stick with those two for now.
It seems like when people analyze violence in society, most people kind of focus on groups and affiliation with groups, whether it be political or religious or anything else. And I'm just recently learning a little more about baboon culture. And what interested me is just the thought that maybe humanity just isn't prone to being peaceful inherently. I'm not saying there's not a solution, but maybe the problem is not, I'm just wondering if the problem is at a more basic level, because baboons only need to feed themselves about 3 hours a day, so they have lots of time, free time to interact, and they basically just make each other miserable, and they're very violent. So I'm wondering if...
Sounds like my 3 boys at home, actually.
I'm wondering if the problem could be, analyzed further from the state of mind that it might, if you wiped society clean of all historical conflicts and old grudges and religions and monetary differences and everything else, wouldn't people just group together again and create conflict immediately?
Good, and let's get the question behind you as well, and we'll answer them as a pair.
Hi, you talked about the nationalism as one possible cause of violence. In the United States, part of our national identity is this idea that we're a melting pot of cultures, and as a people we go out of our way to be very inclusive. There are groups, however, that define themselves as religious who find that whole notion of inclusiveness to be repulsive. And I wonder if you have any ideas on how we as a people should deal with these groups without compromising our own ideal of inclusiveness.
Bomb them into inclusivity.
With baboons, I think is the connection there. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm being ironic, but unfortunately, that is sometimes the solution that's offered. That's Christopher Hitchens's idea. We can't really rest until everybody has been secularized, because religion is inherently dangerous. And if we need to impose, this is what Sam Harris said too, if we need to, we can't reason with such people, because religious people are inherently irrational. So what we need to do is, if we have to do it through military means, then by all means we do that for their own sake, right? And I think that's a very pernicious kind of argument. The baboon question, I just want to punt that over to Larry and Margaretha, and see what you all have to say about that.
I don't know. I'm always careful to consider these essentialist kind of ideas. People are born this way and they cannot be any other way. I don't know about your plan of wiping society clean of all the past problems, but I do believe that people can grow and change, and that societies change. So I don't know. I don't think we are necessarily born with no solution ever.
Yeah, my response to that is that I would question whether baboons are always violent. I don't believe that's the case. I think baboons are also cooperative. They're a social animal. And they work together on projects. So there is a piece of them that is violent, but I wouldn't definitively say they're just violent.
But the problem is violence, and not religious violence or secular violence. The problem is violence, and so and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm trying to kind of clear away some of these myths so that we can examine the question of violence. Can I go back to the second? I'm sorry, I was a little bit too flippant, I think, with the second question that was made. I mean, one thing I do want to say is that, these questions of inclusivity and tolerance and coexistence with one another are very difficult questions. And I don't think, the kinds of societies that you talk about exist, and they're not to be, and they're not off limits for criticism, right? I mean, there are societies that are intolerant and oppressive, and we need to talk about that, and we need to do what we can to encourage better living conditions for people. We need to be careful when we apply a kind of one-size-fits-all solution to every society on Earth. And that's when we begin to do violence, is when we assume that we have discovered the answer to the happiness of the rest of the world, and we just want to share that with everybody. Which is really the whole trajectory of American foreign policy over the 20th century has been Wilsonian in this way. Woodrow Wilson articulated the idea that we really had discovered the secret to the happiness of all human beings, and it's open elections and open markets. And we need to share that with everybody at gunpoint if necessary. And you find this Wilsonian strand coming up over and over again. You find it in Clinton, you find it in Bush. If you want to read a couple of really interesting books, Andrew Bacevich his books, American Empire and the something about American militarism. He's got several books, they're all good. He speaks about these matters with a particular authority because he's not only a political scientist, a professor of political science, but he's a retired Army colonel who spent 20 years in the military. So Andrew Bacevich is excellent.
All right, we're going to have time for 2 more questions. There's one here in front and then one, I believe, in the back. And we'll ask that both the questioners and the respondents be brief since we're running out of time.
Okay. It seems like in the face of religious conflict and violence, a kind of easy solution has been proposed where we kind of pretend that all religions teach basically the same thing, that they're all essentially the same. But when you actually look at them, they are very different. So what I wonder is, do you think it's possible to acknowledge and to talk about like the legitimate differences between faiths without resorting to violence? And if so, how do you think that's possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me just extend the comments that I made to the last question there too. That nothing I've said should immunize anybody from criticism. When I talk about leveling the playing, I said that at the end of my talk, when I talk about leveling the playing field, that doesn't mean that we declare before the game starts that it's going to end in a tie. And so there are malignant forms of Islam that should be criticized. There are malignant forms of Christianity that should be criticized. There are malignant forms of secularism that should be criticized. Nothing is immune from criticism. It's just that the point that I'm trying to make is that when you impose this religious secular lens on the discussion from the beginning, it's distorted right from the start. But I'm a theologian and I like talking theology, and I think that there are good theologies and there are bad theologies. And let's start the discussion, but let's not start the discussion with a kind of distorting lens from the beginning.
Let me ask a rather naive question. What do you define as violence? And I say that from the perspective of being a medic. I hold to a creed of do no harm, but sometimes that's not good enough. And I'm wondering if your definition of violence and my definition of violence is the same.
Do you want me to answer that, or?
You're stuck with that one.
Okay. Yeah. I don't have a good definition of violence yet. I don't know if I talk about this question in the introduction to the book, and I kind of punt it, and I say that the definition of violence that I'm going to use in this book is the definition of violence that the people that I'm criticizing are using. So I'm looking at their use of the word violence and the use of the word religion, and doing an analysis of that. So for the purposes of the book and for the purposes of the argument that I'm making here, I don't need a definition of violence. All I need to do is take what they seem to mean by it, which is basically bodily harm and killing. War is the primary example that most of them use. If we're going to take the next step, which is actually analyzing what is violence and how can we undo it and so on, then I'm going to need to develop a definition of violence. But for the purposes of this argument, I'm just assuming the definition of violence as kind of bodily injury and death that my interlocutors are using.
And in peace studies, we talk about 2 different forms of violence. One is structural violence, the other one is direct violence. Direct violence is the kind of violence that Professor Cavanaugh is talking about, and that's physical harm. War is a good example of it. Physical violence is a good example of it. Structural violence is the more insidious kind of violence that systems in our society, structures in our society that result in oppression, inequality, the unequal distribution of resources, human rights kinds of things. That's a different kind of violence.
I think I mentioned earlier, just briefly, when we talk about violence against women, Of course, there is physical violence, rape or assault or so, but there's also a level of emotional violence. And then there's also things like financial violence, you know, who controls the money and who gets to spend the money. So yeah, I think you're onto something, how to define violence. Yeah.
So we end then with a question, I think, and Judy Sabul is going to have a few words to say to close with, but let's thank all of our speakers for the stimulating meeting.
And we also owe a great deal of thanks to Dr. Bauman and also to Marguerite Stanchu, who helps put so many details together for all the wonderful people at Clues. And for each of you, because this really is about civic dialogue, conversation, engagement. I have to echo what Dr. Gerstein said. I look out at the city of Indianapolis and I look at this group and I see a bit of a microcosm of Indianapolis, and I have a lot of hope for our city because you guys are here. So thank you for that. We return on March 1st for a conversation about faith-based development work and how is that peacemaking. So maybe that's more opportunity for hope. We really want to keep talking with you. If anybody wants to fill out this form and be part of some focus groups and some conversations with some very bright Butler students, we'd be most grateful. The Center for Faith and Vocation wants to continue to learn from you and maybe find ways to serve you all better. Thank you again for this evening, and we'll see you on March 1st.